Hello and welcome to your world history class. Today we're going to be looking at the lesson question, which is right on the screen here, of how do historians study the past. Now some of you may be sitting in your chairs and be thinking, well, why am I even here? I don't want to be a historian. I have no interest in world history. Well, I hope throughout this course we're able to change your mind. Now some of you who really enjoy world history, we hope to build on that. But like I said, we're going to start that foundation by looking at this lesson question, which one more time is, how do historians study the past? So let's go ahead and get started. Well, to learn how historians study the past, we need to look at this in three separate ways. In the first way, we need to understand the differences between primary and secondary sources. Secondly, we needed to know how to identify different types of maps and how to use them. Thirdly, we need to identify how archaeology and anthropology are important to the study of history. But before we start any of that, let's take a quick look at your words to know, which are on the screen here. Now the green word, this is bias. This is your academic word. This is one you will see throughout this course. The purple words, these are your domain-specific words. Now these specifically are anthropology, geography, historiography, primary source, and secondary source. So if you take a look at the lesson question, which is right above me, it says, how do historians study the past? Now we're going to answer that question in three separate parts. Now in the first part, we're going to be looking at the sources of history. We're going to be looking at primary documents versus secondary documents, or primary source versus secondary source. In the second part, we're going to be looking at the tools of geography. And in the third and final part, we're going to be looking at the uses of archaeology and anthropology. Now you may recognize this picture here. This is of Stonehenge, which is actually located in England. Now the thing about Stonehenge is that no one is actually certain about why it was built or how it was built. If you take a look at it, you can see there are these massive rocks that have been stacked on top of other rocks. Now experts in many different fields have come together to try to figure out or put together the puzzle of why this was built. So for example, if you're a historian, you would study Stonehenge and talk about what happened 5,000 years ago. You would say, well, what happened 5,000 years ago, and how could that have been linked together to figure out why Stonehenge was built? Now if you're an archaeologist, you're going to look at this and you're going to see that it was obviously man-made. So you're going to look at it as an artifact. Going on, if you are an anthropologist, you would perhaps look for clues, maybe written on the rocks, that would give clues or insights into the society that built Stonehenge. And finally, not all of these stones came from the exact same quarry. So if you're a geographer, you would study which stones came from which quarry and how did they all get there. So you can see how many different experts will put together all of their different expertise to try to put together a puzzle like Stonehenge. Let's take a look at that lesson question, which again is right above me. It says, how do historians study the past? Well, we just saw how historians and people from many different fields come together to try to solve a problem, such as why was Stonehenge built? Well, in this first part of this lesson, we're going to be looking at the sources of history. We're going to be looking at primary sources versus secondary sources. So let's go ahead and get started with this first part. History, it offers us a whole host of things. But before that, we need to understand that the word history actually means to ask, or it means to know, and that's the meaning in Greek. So history, knowing that, it offers us a record of the past, which could be, like right here, the Romance history of Mexico. It also offers us descriptions of significant past events, a battle, a war, a movement that took place. It offers us an explanation of how past events are connected. How, if this battle took place, what was the effect of it? That's really important to be able to understand. And finally, history offers an interpretation of their causes and their meanings, which is really important as well. But let's make sure we broaden our idea of history. Is it just books? Oh, absolutely not. It could be things like pictures. It could be diaries. It could be recordings. Right now, it could be videos that you've just taken. Those are all forms of things that we could study in history. Because when we're studying history, the people who study history do it for a number of reasons. To begin with, they want to understand how the society we live in came to be. The United States nowadays didn't just come to be just now. There's a whole host of events that happened before that, and all of these things influenced where we are right now. And we really need to understand that. Also, people who study history, they want to understand other people and other societies. Third, they want to help us learn about ourselves. How do we impact, or how has history impacted us? How has where my family came from or how I was raised impacted the person I am today? And finally, people who study history want to learn from the mistakes of the past. And that's really summed up here by George Santayana in 1905, where he says, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And this you really find in history, where people will try the same thing over and over and over again. And guess what? It fails over and over and over again. You can see that especially sometimes if you're teaching. I remember when I was teaching in DC, I would go back and I would look at the students and I would think, hey, if you do this, this is going to happen because you did this exact same thing before. And sure enough, that student would do the exact same thing and the exact same result would take place. So those are just some of the reasons why it's really important to study history. So a key thing that you'll really want to be able to do throughout this course is understand and be able to write as a historian. And that type of writing is called historiography, which is the writing of history and how it changes over time. So the writing is based on research, going on the internet and finding credible websites, or going to the library and taking a look at an encyclopedia. And the writing, it creates a narrative or a story. Always think of the actual word. When you see his story, you can see that story is written into the word history. And historians, they'll examine each other's writing. So many times if a historian from this university wants his writing to be reviewed by a historian from that university, so he'll send them their writing and say, hey, what do you think of this? Does this sound good? Does this sound bad? What are your thoughts? A key thing that historians will use, you can see on the screen here, and these are timelines. And you'll see a number of these throughout this course. So let me help break it down for you. First, notice a couple things. One is that it says 500 BCE all the way to 500 CE. That is the range of time that this timeline actually shows. BCE refers to before Common Era, before the year 0. You may also see it written as BC, and anything after the year 0 you'll see as CE or Common Era, and sometimes you'll also see it written as AD. The key thing to note is that these and these mean the same thing. So if you see BC or BCE, they mean the same thing. Again, back to this timeline. A couple things I want to show you. If you see one single line, that means that event happened during that year. So Alexander the Great was born in 356. But if you go earlier, you can see that the Peloponnesian War was fought, not in one year, but throughout this year, or excuse me, throughout these years. That's why you see it built more like this and shaded in. That means it happened for an extended period of time. You can see right here is an individual event, right here is an individual event, and here's an individual event. Another thing I want you to notice is that you see this is the time frame of this timeline. Notice that it does not go up to, let's say, 2013. So on this timeline, you would never see an event from 2013 because it only goes from these time periods or from in between those time periods. So when you see these various timelines, make sure you have a good grasp of how they can be used and how you can use them to really give a good graphic look at what you're studying. So as you're learning to become a historian, you're going to be looking at two different types of historical sources. The first are primary sources, and the second are secondary sources. Let's take a look at the first, or primary sources. Now, primary sources, they were created by a direct observer of an event or period, someone who was actually at the event. In addition, they were created during the time period that's being studied. Now, these can include things like diaries, letters, photographs, works of arts, and government records. Jumping over to the other side, or the second type of source, these are secondary sources. Now, secondary sources were created by someone who did not participate or observe an event. And in addition, they were often written long after the event occurs. Let's say, for example, someone releases a book currently about the fall of the Roman Empire. That would be a secondary source because that person was obviously not there and it was written long after the event occurred. In addition, they were often based on primary sources. So the person writing about the Roman Empire may have been looking at ancient Roman government records to write their book. Now, secondary sources, examples of them could include textbooks, history books, or encyclopedias. So these are just the differences between primary sources and secondary sources, but you're going to be using both in your historical research. So as a historian, you really need to be able to evaluate your sources. Now, historians examining the source, they need to focus on many different factors. First, they need to know what kind of source it is. Is it a primary source? Is it a secondary source? Secondly, they need to know when it was created. Was it written down very close to the event, or was it written down years or decades after it? Thirdly, they need to talk about and figure out and examine how credible is the source. So for example, if you have an inexperienced infantryman at a battle and he says, there was a force of 10,000 soldiers coming upon us, but then you had an experienced infantryman say, there was actually a force of 5,000 enemy soldiers coming toward us, the person who has more experience, most likely they are more credible. Finally, you need to look at, did the author have a particular point of view? Now this leads into our last point of looking at bias. Now bias is the tendency to see some topic or issue in a particular way. Now everyone has a bias, but we've just got to make sure that as you're writing your history, you try to stay as neutral as possible. So this is just how you evaluate some of your sources. Well, because history is written by people, and because people make mistakes, there are obviously many criticisms of history. Let's take a look at two of them right here. The first is interpretation. Now what we're talking about here is that historians, we must fill in gaps of incomplete historical records. Now there is no totally complete historical record in existence. So what historians must do, we must find the holes in that historical record and fill it in as best we can. Now the second criticism of history is changing perspectives. Now what we're talking about here is that over time, historians change their minds about what is important. Let's take the American Civil Rights Movement, where before the Civil Rights Movement, you would find many pieces of writing that would focus on just the white population. But during and after the Civil Rights Movement, you found much more literature based on African Americans as well as Latino Americans. So that's just how historians change their mind about what is important over time. Now, another criticism of historiography, or writing about history, is summed up in this quote here, which Sir Winston Churchill may have said, where he may have said, history is written by the victors. Now, what he's talking about, and I'll give you a real-world example. Now, a textbook written in the 1700s about colonialism from the British perspective, the colonizers, it would be very positive. They would say, colonization is a great thing. Look at all the benefits we are getting out of it. However, if you read that same textbook from, let's say, the American Indian perspective, it would be written much differently. However, because Winston Churchill claims history is written by the victors, that is what he's talking about here, is that the people who win, they write the history textbooks. So just make sure you keep all these things in mind, all these criticisms in mind as you're studying history. Well, great job. We just finished with the first part of the lesson. Now we're going to move on to the second part. But before we do, let's take a look at that lesson question, which is right above me. It says, how do historians study the past? Well, recall, in the first part, we talked about the sources of history, primary versus secondary source, as well as some of the criticisms of historians. Now, in this second part, we're going to be looking at the tools of geography. So let's go ahead and get started with this second part of the lesson. Well, geography plays a key role in our knowledge of the past. Now, geography is the scientific study of the features and processes of Earth, and it focuses on two different things. Number one, it focuses on physical or non-man-made, let's say, for example, a volcano, in this case, Mount Vesuvius, also on human features as well, like the city of Pompeii. Secondly, it relies on maps, which you can see on the right of this screen, charts, and other visual aids. Now, geography and history are very closely related. Let's take a look at this picture over here. Actually, this is a map. Now, it shows, as the title says, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79. Do you remember what CE means? Well, that's Common Era. So this happened 79 years after the year 0. And you can see on this map in the key where the lighter gray areas are the areas of damage caused by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but the darker gray is where the worst damage occurred. For example, in Pompeii, that is where some of the worst damage occurred. Now I want to draw your attention to the bottom. This right here is the scale, where if it is between here and here, if you use a ruler or a piece of paper, that is 10 miles approximately. So if you measure it from Mount Vesuvius to Pompeii, using that, it would almost be 10 miles from Mount Vesuvius to Pompeii. So that's how you use a scale whenever you see it. Well, in addition to this, there are many different types of maps, and each of them serve a different purpose. Let's start with the first type. Now, this is a political map. Now, political maps, they show political boundaries or different countries or different states. This right here, you may recognize as Europe, where you have Iceland, you have Spain, you have France. They're in different colors, so you can clearly note which country is which. The second form are physical maps. Now, physical maps show physical features, or mountains, highlands, or for example, rivers. So that's what a physical map focuses on. The third type are special purpose maps. Now this one right here shows the earthquake that happened in Haiti, where it shows where the epicenter, or the earthquake, the center of the earthquake was right here in the center of that circle, but it shows where the earthquake affected, or the rings outside of the epicenter. So those are the three different types of maps. Now, when you're reading a map, you need to have a lot of things in mind. You really need to take a look at a lot of different parts of the map. The first are lines of latitude and lines of longitude. Now, latitude, think of a ladder, the rungs of a ladder like this. So all of these lines that go like this is latitude, or the rungs of a ladder. The longitude are the lines that go like this. So you have longitude and you have latitude. Those are different ways that you can note different places on a map. In addition, here's your scale, which we talked about. Now this map right here, can you recall what type of map it is? Well, it's a physical map. Now we know it's a physical map because it's showing physical features, like we said, rivers or mountains. Now in addition, it's showing over here, judging by the different colors, how high above sea level the different areas are. Where if it's green, this is 0, or it's at sea level. All right, but if the lighter the color is way down here, or even if it is slightly brown, this is above, or feet above sea level. So you can spot the mountains right here, and all along here as well. So these are just some of the things that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at maps. Well, great job, scholars. We finished the first two parts of the lesson. Now on to the final part. But before we move on, let's take a look at that lesson question, which is right above me. It says, how do historians study the past? Now recall, in the first part of the lesson, we looked at the sources of history. We talked about primary sources, secondary sources, and the criticisms of history. In the second part, we looked at the tools of geography. We broke down the maps and we looked at the scale, the legend, what types of maps there are. Now in this third and final part, we're going to look at the uses of archaeology and anthropology. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's begin by looking at anthropology. Now, anthropology is a study of human origins, societies, and cultures, and it examines two main things. The first is the way that ancient cultures were similar and different. How was a culture in ancient Europe similar or different from a culture in ancient China, for example? The second thing that an anthropologist examines are languages, customs, and social behaviors as well. Now, they may take a look at a group of monkeys and compare how a monkey group would socialize to a group of human beings, for an example. Now, a subset of anthropology is archaeology. Now, archaeology is the scientific study of human history through the examination of artifacts. You can see a number of artifacts on the screen to the right. These are different arrowheads. Now, these would be attached sometimes to the head of a spear and form a weapon or something to hunt with. Now, artifacts, they could be everyday things made by earlier people. We just looked at an example right here of an arrowhead, but it could also be human remains as well. Let's say a bone or some hair. These are all examples of artifacts. Now, archaeologists, they perform archaeological digs, where archaeologists will use everyday tools along with specialized electronic tools. So you would see them with maybe a pick and a shovel, but you would really see them with very sophisticated electronic tools as well. Now, what they do is they carefully excavate, they preserve, and they study artifacts that are found at their archaeological digs. You can see an example of one on the screen here. This is a dig that's going on in Jamestown, Virginia. Now, Jamestown was one of the earliest settlements by the British in North America. Now, the layers of earth can reveal the relative ages of objects. Now, this is pretty important. Let's take a look at this dig right here, where if they're digging down and a foot down, they find an artifact right here, okay? But they dig down another foot and they find another artifact right here. Well, using this idea of relative ages, the deeper you dig down, the older the artifact will be. So this artifact would be older than this artifact because it is deeper in the ground. That's what we're talking about when we say relative age. Now, there are many different dating methods. Now, archaeologists, they date or express the age of artifacts in two main ways. The first is by using relative age. Now, relative age is the age of an object in relation to other objects. Kind of like the example we just spoke about how one artifact was found deeper than the other, so this artifact is probably older than this artifact. Now, this is also called correlated age. Now, in addition, the second way is by using absolute age. Now, this is the actual age of an object in years. Was it 100 years old? Was it 5,000 years old? Now, this is also called calendar age. So you'll see this, for example, of this artifact was found in 100 BCE, or before Common Era. You may also see it as in 2000 CA, or circa, or we believe it was around 2,000 years. So those are just some ways, and some ways you can have dating methods that archaeologists use. Now, there are other dating methods as well. One of them is called dendrochronology. Now, this examines the rings of ancient trees to establish an absolute date. Now, if you look at the picture here, you'll notice there are obviously rings around this tree. You may have seen this if you've ever seen a tree that has been chopped down. Well, each ring usually notates 1 year. Now, if you take a look at this picture here, you'll see that some have larger spaces between the rings than other ones. Now, many times that can notate that a drought took place during this year, or perhaps if it grew a great deal, like for example right here, there was plenty of water. So these are all clues that archaeologists can use. The second dating method is radiocarbon dating, which measures the chemical change in an artifact to establish its precise age. Now, all living things have carbon in them. That could be a human bone, that could be a tree like you see right here. And what archaeologists can do is they can measure the amount of carbon left in that tree or in that bone, and based on the amount of carbon left, they can measure the precise age. So let's take a look at how well you know the difference between archaeologists and anthropologists.